We're studying the life of Joseph, and we've covered the first major story in Joseph's life. When he was 17, we saw in chapter 37 that Joseph was rising in trustworthiness, authority, and honor in his own home, in the house of Jacob. We saw that Jacob loved him, and it was given Joseph his favor. And it was shown to us by that garment, the coat that had various colors that may have looked something like this. And it showed everyone whom Jacob's favorite was and who had the authority in the household, to whom would the inheritance go to. And just like that favor from his father was rising, also his hatred and jealousy from his brothers were also rising. But not only did Joseph receive the favor of his father, Joseph also received the favor of God. God communicated to him two dreams, one with around sheaves of grain and also around celestial bodies. And both of those communicated that his family in the future would bow down to him. Even his mother and father would bow down to Joseph. The second part of that major narrative about Joseph's life when he was 17 is that Joseph was sent on a mission by his father. The rest of the brothers were in the northern part, about 50 miles away, tending the sheep. And the father sent Joseph there to check on them. Then we saw that when Joseph reached the location in Shechem, they weren't there. But God had orchestrated it in such a way that there was an unnamed man there who asked Joseph who he's looking for, and also that he knew where the brothers had gone. He had overheard it. It shows that God was orchestrating this movement into redirection where Joseph would have that meeting with the brothers. Well, the brothers then reject Joseph. When he gets there, when he's coming at a distance, the brothers see him, probably recognizing his coat, and they first plot to murder him. Reuben steps in and says, no, we can't murder him. Let's put him in a pit. With all the while in his mind, he was knowing that he was going to rescue him during the night in the cover of darkness and return him to Jacob, hopefully to regain favor with Jacob. But what happened was the plot to make a few shekels prevailed. And what had happened was in verse 25, they were sitting down to eat a meal while their brother Joseph was in a pit. And they raised their eyes and looked, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites were coming from Gilead, and with their camels bearing aromatic gums and balms and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. And Judah thought, let's not kill him. Let's make a few shekels. Let's sell him as a slave. Now, one thing I wanted to mention that we didn't mention last week is that you notice in the text that it specifically says that the caravan was carrying aromatic gums and balms and myrrh. This is a detail that is not necessary for the narrative. We don't need to know that information. And therefore, it implies that detail adds to the story. It adds an element to Joseph's story. And what those were used for, they're not native to Egypt. They're coming in from the land of Canaan. And they're primarily used for medicines. But they also are used for incense, and they smell nice. They smell good. And this really gives a flavor of what Joseph is going to be. Joseph is going to join that caravan, and he as well is going to be brought to Egypt as a means of healing Egypt and as a sweet aroma to Egypt from the land of Canaan. So once Joseph is gone, in the caravan, sold, then his brothers deceive their father Jacob. And there's a cover-up. They bring back the garment. They put blood from a goat, and they deceive him. So he believes that Joseph is dead, which causes him to have great sorrow and great distress. And then the end of the chapter ends with a conclusion about what happened with Joseph, that he was taken down into Egypt. And there we're left wondering, well, what happened to him? What will become of him? And the narrative now in the next chapter 39, answers that question. And it begins to answer that question, because the story really lasts for many chapters. In chapter 39, we see the houses of Joseph. And this morning, we're going to consider two houses of Joseph, away from his father's house. But first, did you notice that I jumped from 37 to 39? And that's because chapter 38 was purposely put in there by Moses, interrupting the narrative story about Joseph, to tell us about Judah. And it's used to contrast the lives of Joseph and Judah, among other things. So let me give you a brief summary of that chapter. The chapter opens with Judah moving out from his father, moving away from Shechem, and he starts a family of his own. So he moves from this area up here to Adullam, and he stays with a man there. And there he gets married to a Canaanite woman who, as they're in Chezib, his wife bears him 3 sons. And after some time, about 20 years pass, his sons are grown, or growing up. And we learn that his eldest son, Er, marries Tamar, but he dies before giving a son, an heir. So as the Levirate law, which is recorded in Exodus, which obviously still is in place here, before there was a written law, there was an oral law, Judah's second son, Onan, marries Tamar in order to produce an heir for his brother that died, Er. But he did evil in the sight of the Lord as well, just like Er did, and the Lord judged him and killed him as well. And then Judah had his third son, and he promises his third son to Tamar, who is Shelah. But he's not old enough. So he promises when he gets older, he will marry her so she can have an heir and a son. And then the text says, but it's after some time. And that amount of time is unknown, but Shelah is now old enough, and Tamar realizes that he's not going to fulfill his promise. That's not going to happen. And in this time as well, Judah's wife dies. And he is now traveling up to Timnah, which is up in this location, to shear his sheep. And Tamar hears of it. And she dresses like a harlot near Enaim, which is right here, on his way up. And Judah stops and has inappropriate relations with her, not realizing who it is, not realizing that it's Tamar. And Tamar then is pregnant, and when she's found to be pregnant, she confronts her father-in-law that it was he who has sinned, and she tells him what she had done and what her plan was, and he repents and realizes that he has done wrong. And then at the end of the chapter, it lets us know that Tamar had twins. God had blessed her with twins. So the conclusion from this chapter, it tells us a few things. One, that Judah's sons were evil in the sight of the Lord, which implies that he was not teaching them God's ways. Judah himself acts deceitfully towards Tamar out of fear, not trusting in God and not doing what's right. Judah also visits a prostitute, but is concerned about paying her. He has moral issues. He's not clear on what's right and wrong. And then also Judah, at the end of the chapter, while he is probably in his 40s or 50s, he realizes that he has been unrighteous, and he repents. So we see a contrast here. We're going to see a contrast between Judah, who is not acting faithfully to God, and then Joseph. So now let's go back to chapter 39, and we'll see the first house that Joseph serves in. And that's the house of Potiphar. Chapter 39, verses 1 through 18. In the first 6 verses, we see the rise of Joseph. So let's start with verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down there. Now this verse purposely repeats what we saw in the end of chapter 37, almost identically, because it's picking up the narrative. The chapter 38 followed the story of Judah for many years. Probably 30 some odd years had passed. So it's going back in time to where they left off with Joseph. And Joseph was taken from the land of Israel and taken down into Egypt, and where the capital would be, where the captain of the bodyguard would have been, is down here in Ithturai. And that's where it's about 350 miles away travel. So that's where Joseph's setting is now, in the house of Potiphar. And if you think about it, look at all the miles he's gone. Everything in Joseph's life has been taken away from him. He's lost his freedom. He is now a stranger in a strange land. This land has different gods. He is now placed in the capital, in a huge city, where he's used to living in tents. There's different customs and different practices. Now, the Egyptian life is centered around the Nile, right? All of life comes from that Nile. They use the Nile for water. They get their food from the Nile. Crops are grown from the Nile's water and irrigation and overflow. The river's overflow that happens once a year puts a nice layer of dirt or sediment over the ground to make it very fertile. It's used for transportation, where ships can easily go down, and when they want to go up the stream, they put up the sail, and the wind blows them right down. So transportation is used. On the banks, clay is used for pots and bricks. Reeds there that grow near the river are used for paper. Everything was centered around the Nile, which is completely different than life in Canaan. So although it seems like everything, every bit of Joseph's life and the way he lived has now changed, one thing has not changed. Verse 2 says, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord has not changed. The Lord was still there with Joseph. So starting in verse 2, it says, the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he'd owned he put in his charge. Now you notice the first phrase is, the Lord was with Joseph. And in the Old Testament, you can see it's all capitalized. That means it's the proper name of God, which is Yahweh. So Yahweh was with him. And that was a promised phrase that Yahweh said he would be with Abraham, would be with Isaac and Jacob. And now we see that Joseph's fulfilling that role as well. And that God is being faithful to the covenant to Joseph. And he's with Joseph. And when it says, what does it mean when it says that Yahweh was with him? It means two things. Number one, it caused Joseph to work and live out a life of integrity. And then number two, the work that Joseph did, his character, his actions, his behavior, was noticeably different and more productive. The Lord blessed him in the things that he set out to do. And in fact, in verse 3 it says, now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. It was noticeable. And it was noticeable that Potiphar, his master, knew that his God produced it. That implies that Joseph didn't hide his faith. He remained a Hebrew. Even though he was had difficult things happen to him, that he was taken away from his land and became a slave, he still had faith, still worshipped Yahweh. And notice that Joseph was in Potiphar's house. He was given charge over his house. So we saw in the first narrative in 37 that Joseph was rising in power and honor in the house of Jacob. Now we see he's rising in authority and in power in the house of Potiphar. So we see a parallel there. And notice how this parallel came about. There was a rise. It wasn't a sudden move. He's down there, he's introduced and put as a head over all his household. No, the first it says, and he was in the house. It implies that he came into the house from the field. Slaves would have worked in the field first, and Joseph was seen to be more prosperous, better worker, integrity. And he was placed into the home and became a household slave. And in his course of doing his household duties, he was also seen to be prosperous, a man of integrity, faithful. And he became his personal assistant, which means he was the steward over the whole household. And everything was put in his charge. Literally, that says it was put into his hand. His hand had the power over everything in the household. That would take time. And that would take consistency of character. And is evident that Potiphar saw that Joseph was a consistent man of integrity and a man of honor. Moving on to verse 5, it says, "And it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. And with him there, he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate." So notice that God is blessing an Egyptian's house, a non-believer's house, on account of Joseph. Now this also took time for Potiphar to see those blessings come about, come into fruition. So we see that at least a few years are passing by here. And now Joseph's authority was complete. He was in charge of everything except for choosing the food that Potiphar ate. Now that could be a figure of speech, meaning that Potiphar still had control over, or cared to have control over, his private affairs. But the text specifically says food here. And it probably does so to foreshadow what's going to happen in the future. That even food, Potiphar's food, is one day going to be under Joseph's control. And in fact, one day, Potiphar is going to be under Joseph's authority. So we know that at the end of Joseph's story, where he's going to produce grain and be the second in command of all of Egypt, that this will be reversed and that Joseph will have authority over even his master here. So notice in this passage, there's an emphasis there on God's name, his proper name. And this is really emphatic in the text because it's showing us that although Joseph is a slave, he's in a strange land, and the circumstances looked bad. But Yahweh had not abandoned him and would not cease to bless him for his faithfulness. This was all part of his plan. So we see again here that Joseph is under authority, just like he was under the authority of his father. He's under the authority of Potiphar, and he's being faithful, and God is blessing him. He's being elevated into a position of greater trust and authority, and it's showing God's control of the circumstances. We are responsible to be faithful to God, and God is in control of how that affects and how that will be worked out and played out in society, in our circumstances, and everything around us. But along with God's blessings, in this story also came the trials at the home. Verses 6 through 18. And first, we see the indecent mistress of the home. Verses 6 through 12. Let's start with verse 6 and 7. It says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.'" Now when it says that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, he had a good physique, and he was handsome. And that same phrase is used of Rachel and his mother in chapter 29, verse 17. So obviously she passed on the good genes. But here, Joseph was a slave, but then he grew in his position of power and authority over the household, and then Potiphar's wife noticed him. And it's the master's wife. And that's important because the master of Joseph, who was a slave, has complete authority and control over Joseph's life. So it adds an element of this is dangerous for Joseph. This is a precarious situation because his master had control over his life and death, blessing or punishment. And you notice that Potiphar was mentioned once in the beginning of chapter 39 and once at the end of 37, but from here on out, he's unnamed. And his wife remains unnamed. And the reason for that is the text wants to focus us on Joseph, completely on Joseph. So notice when it says that the master's wife looked with desire at Joseph. That word for looked, we've seen that before. And there's a narrative link to chapter 37, where it said, and they, referring to the brothers, when they sat down at the meal, and as they raised their eyes, that word is the same word in Hebrew as looked. So when we read this in this new narrative in chapter 39, we can tell that something bad is about to happen. It indicates that there's going to be a change for the worse in Joseph. Now the text simply says in a short phrase that his wife said, lie with me. Now she probably said a lot more things than that in different words, but the text simplifies it because the point is she wanted to have inappropriate marital relations with Joseph, and she was married to someone else. And the word for lie there is probably a little bit of wordplay going on because the verb is used euphemistically of one who lies down because they're dead. So it adds color to what she's asking, especially the results of that. Like the brothers who threw Joseph down into the pit from his high position, here we see Potiphar's wife trying to bring Joseph down into her bed and literally into a position that's colored by death from his high position in the household. In the repetition of both these words and the movements from high positions to a lower position, we see a purposeful strategy to bring down Joseph, both in that story and this story. And it reveals to us that there's an unnamed force behind these characters of Satan's kingdom that's trying to stop the people of God from bringing about God's purposes. They're trying to thwart Joseph from being faithful. And that is Satan's strategy even today, to stop God's people from being faithful to God, as being a witness of him. So here, Satan wants to cause Joseph to be unfaithful. But then we see Joseph's response. He says, but he refused and said to his master's wife, and then what follows is his quote. But let's stop before that. Number one, we need to point out that Joseph, he's a young man. He's about 20 years old. And for him to say no, to refuse to his master's wife, he has to have incredible self-control. And he not only refused her advances once, but as we're going to see in a moment, it continued. And he tries to explain to her, gives 3 reasons to her why he cannot do that. He says, number 1, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. So number 1, if he does this, it would be a great abuse of the trust that's been placed in him. And number 2 says, there is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil? So number 2, he can't do this because it's a betrayal and offense against her husband, his master, Potiphar. It'd be a personal sin and attack, harming him. And he can't do that. Especially someone who's treating him with such great kindness and great trust and goodness and generosity. And then number 3, he said, and sin against God. He can't do this act because it's a sin against his God. So notice that these 3, they all relate to one act. They're all connected. When we are tempted to sin, we need to realize that the damage that happens, it's not just towards God or towards someone else, it's everything altogether. So number 1, sin damages one's reputation. He will no longer be trustworthy or trusted. Number 2, it hurts relationships. If Joseph went ahead and did that, it would hurt the relationship between Potiphar and his wife, and possibly destroy that marriage. So sin hurts relationships with others. And then 3rd, sin offends God. God is the creator and owns Joseph in all of life and has expressed the ways that he has designed his creation to work. And if Joseph does not obey his ways, he is insulting and sinning against his God. So there's a side note here. The question is, how does Joseph know that adultery is a sin against God? This is another indication that there was a moral law of God before Exodus was written down, and that moral law was passed verbally. So moving on here, this verse indicates, because Joseph knows this, it indicates that Jacob had been teaching Joseph God's ways. And now that he is older, he's not departing. And he's not departing because Joseph has his own faith and trust in God. He's made it personal. He's made it his own. And the things that his father has taught him growing up, he's now applying and putting his whole faith into as he's walking through life, coming into new circumstances and new situations. It shows both the importance of parents teaching their children, even if they don't understand or not in those circumstances. But when they do, they won't depart. And then secondly, it shows that Joseph is a man of faith and he's applying these things from his childhood. And here is where the contrast comes in between Joseph and his brother Judah, who was much older at the time when he has his inappropriate marital relations, so he should have known more. But it shows that although they were raised in the same household and probably taught the same thing by Jacob, Judah was not faithful to God where Joseph was. So, unfortunately, this doesn't end the issue. Although Joseph gives 3 reasons why he can't do this and won't do this, she goes on. Verse 10, it says, "And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he didn't listen to her, to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was inside there. She caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside." Notice, it happened day after day. This was repeatedly. He had to say no. And in fact, it says, and he didn't listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. So these are lesser things. She saw that he wouldn't have inappropriate relationships. Well, then she tried to say, well, okay, let's back it up. Just lie with me, beside me, hoping to get him caught into that, going in that direction. And then Joseph put a barrier and said, I'm not going to even be with her. I'm uncomfortable around her. And that's going to be inappropriate because of revealed desires that she has. So Joseph is not willing to compromise at all and put himself in a tempting or inappropriate position. Joseph is wisely setting a barrier or a boundary so that sin won't happen. Not necessarily a temptation or boundary for him, although it could be, the text doesn't tell us. But it would be for her. So the text goes on to tell us in verse 11 that it happened one day that he's going into his house, and it's specific that he's going in there to do his work. Moses, when he wrote this, clarifies the integrity of Joseph. But there's no men there. It's important for men because they were witnesses in court. They could serve as witnesses where women couldn't. So here, there's no men there to validate the truth. It's going to be her word against his. And based on his answer previously, Potiphar's wife, in her own mind, in her twisted thinking, she might be thinking, well, he refused me only because he was afraid of being caught. Well, now that we're alone, that might not happen. And he'll give in, and he'll definitely come. So Joseph's now alone with this woman, and no one would see them. And she grabs him. Literally, it says she caught him. That's a military term. It's usually a military context, and it signifies that she grabbed him kind of violently and held on. And notice she caught him his garment. And again, saying the same thing, lie with me. Now it's back to that, to have inappropriate relations with me. And he left his garment. Now the word there for garment is a general term for clothing. But it probably refers to his tunic, his outer tunic, which would have been costly because he was the head of the household. So it probably had either made out of special material or had embroidery or colors that identified his position of authority in the household. So again, we see Joseph and his garments of authority coming into his story. And it says that he left his garment and fled. The word for fled is also used in a military context of escaping a battle in order to save one's life. And he went outside the house rather than betray the trust of his master and sin against his God and lose his reputation and his witness. That shows integrity. Now let me explain a little bit more why that shows an incredible integrity and honor of Joseph. Joseph left his garment and fled outside. Those are symbolic acts. Remember, his garment identifies for the rest of his world his position of authority in the household. And he fled where? Outside the house. So by doing that, those two actions, it shows that he was surrendering his position of authority and leaving the household of Potiphar in order not to sin. This was the right thing to do. And we see that being faithful to God and not sinning, it's going to cost Joseph. And we need to remember when we see this story two things. Number one, the sin of others had put him in a position that obedience to God meant that he would suffer loss. And then number two, that position that he found himself in the first place of authority and honor, that was granted to him by God. So, although he was losing not anything that he had, but he was losing that which God had given him in the first place. And God had given it to him and had taken it away, he could give it to him again. Notice the text says that the garment, she caught him by his garment and said, "Lie with me," and he left his garment in her hand. In her hand, that's a symbolic act as well of having authority. His garment, literally his position, his power, was literally in her hands, and figuratively, his future. Everything was now in her control. So what is she going to do? Well, the text tells us that she's going to falsely make accusations. Verses 13 through 18. So first she turns to the other servants of the house and says, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed, and when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment outside beside me and fled and went outside." So the text is communicating here in the story that she has evidence that Joseph was there and now was gone, and now she's putting a spin on the story. The first thing she does is call the men. Now remember, there was no men in the house. That was the situation that caused this in the first place, this temptation and this compromising situation. So she had to go out somewhere near a window and yell for them to come in and wait for them to come in. Now it's amazing that she could yell and they could hear her, but somehow they never heard the screams. But anyway, notice in her words to the servants, the men, she's trying to cause division. First she says, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew." He, meaning the master of the house, Potiphar, her husband. Why is it he? That's distancing language. That's trying to make a distance between the servants and Potiphar, making a distinction in class and trying to cause a class warfare. And then it says that he has brought in a Hebrew, showing that he's responsible for this incident. And the Hebrew there, it's not a racist comment. The Egyptians weren't necessarily racist, but it is a cultural bias. The Egyptians welcomed everyone in as long as they became and lived like Egyptians. If they kept their own culture, then they had more of a problem. But here she's emphasizing he's a foreigner in a different culture. We know that Joseph did because he worshiped his own God. And she says, this Hebrew came into us and made sport of us. Now, the idea of making sport is Joseph was using her, and thus them, she's claiming all of them, for his own pleasure. And thus it was very offensive. And it emphasizes us. So she wants all of the servants to be on her side. She's trying to show that she is with them and that they need to be with her. She wants the men to side with her and even over her husband, because she knows that her husband loves Joseph and trusts him and greatly values him. So she wants to make sure that her case is heard and that Joseph gets punished. So she says that he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. The idea of leaving his garment beside her, it's, again, communicates that she didn't rip it off of him, but that he was undressing and leaving his garment there. So she's communicating the story. Factually, she's saying a lot of things that are correct, but she's putting a spin on it to make it favorable to her, saying that she didn't sin, but Joseph did. So, second party that she communicates to is Potiphar. Verse 16 says, so she left his garment beside her until his master came home. How long was that? We don't know. It could have been hours. Then, verse 17, then she spoke to him with these words, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came into me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now first, notice in verse 16, it says, and she left his garment beside her until his, Joseph's, master came home. It's because Potiphar had the control over Joseph's life. That's an important part. And it says, the Hebrew slave, again, here's the distinction. It's not an Egyptian, it's not us, it's him. And Joseph is a slave. She's trying to distinguish, I'm your wife, and he's a lonely slave. Reminds of the class distinction. She's trying to emphasize that this crime was even greater. And she says, in whom you brought to us. Trying to emphasize that he's responsible for the damage and the hurt and sorrow that she's feeling. Making sport of us. She changed the us to me. Focusing on her harm. And Joseph was using her for his own pleasure. And that she screamed. Now, you notice the text, this is the third time that the text tells us that she screamed. It was used here in 14, here in 15, and now here in our text. And the reason why it's emphatic is that as Deuteronomy 22, verses 24 through 27, echo or give that law, which was common in the ancient world, that if someone is being violated, if a woman screams, yells out, she is considered to have no wrong done, that she is completely a victim, and she's exonerated from any foul play or wrong. So she's emphasizing here that she was innocent. Well, of course, is a lie. So remember, Joseph is outside. He has no idea what she's saying, what she has been saying to the servants and now to Potiphar himself. So here, this is the second time now that Joseph was elevated to a position of authority and honor, and then now he's stripped of his position. And his garment was involved, and people are lying about him. So we see kind of a pattern forming here. So this brings us to the second house. The second house is the prison house, verse 19 through 23. And first we see the wrongful imprisonment, 19 through 20. So let's read that. It says, now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. So notice his master, Joseph's a slave. It emphasizes one kind of relationship. Heard the words of his wife, different relationship. Who is he going to side with? It's going to be his wife. And notice the text focuses on when he heard the words, your slave did this to me, your wife. It's emphasizing there's an either or here. There's an either or decision. And his anger burned. He felt betrayed. And it's focused on because of his hurt wife. With this attempted rape in Deuteronomy 22:23 through 27, with two free people, the punishment is death, it's execution. But here there's a slave involved, and they would not have received the same kind of grace, or they would not receive better treatment, but worse. So the question is, why does Potiphar put him in jail instead of having him killed? Text does not give us a clear answer, and we don't really know, and it's really baffled a lot of scholars throughout the years. It could be a number of things. Number one, it could be the number of years of great in service that Joseph has done for Potiphar, and the great blessings that Joseph had brought. It could be that Joseph had been pleading with him and told him his side of the story. It could have been that Potiphar knew his wife, the character of his wife, and that she was not necessarily innocent here. Or that he couldn't decide what was the truth of it. Or it could be that his wife wanted just to punish Joseph, but not to have him killed. We just don't know, but we see God's hand of protection here, that Joseph went into prison instead of being put to death. So he is in the jail. Now literally that word for jail is the house of prison. And it continues that pattern to show a third house. Jacob's house, Potiphar's house, now the house of the prison. So the word for jail, there's also probably a fortress or a citadel. It kind of means rounded as well. It's where they would have forced labors within the jail system. And the words that are used are really focusing that Joseph is not getting out. He's stuck there. This is where the royal prisoners were kept, so there'd be the greatest protection and guarding. And how do you think Joseph is feeling right about now? This incident is a sober reminder of the wide destruction that a lying tongue can produce. And in it, we see Satan's purposes. He's the father of lies, and he wants to create and build destruction and harm in people's lives. And he's doing it here in ours. But the text says that Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail. Now this word here for master, the Hebrew text is purposely ambiguous. The word there is Adonai, which can mean master as in Potiphar, the human master, but it also can mean Lord, as in God being master. In the Old Testament, when you see Lord with just the L being capitalized, it's Adonai. It's the same word. So there's probably a play on words here where we can see that God, Joseph's Lord, meaning God, took him and put him into jail. So probably through Potiphar's actions, we see God's sovereign hand as well, putting him into the jail instead of being put to death. Before we move on in the text, we need to ask one question. Why put Joseph through this? Why did God elevate him to a position of authority in Potiphar's house only to remove him and put him into jail here? Number one, God has a plan. God has a purpose. And as this Joseph story unfolds, we're going to see more and more why. But at this point, let's say Joseph was well acquainted with how a wealthy Egyptian household and family functioned, from in the field to household duties to running the whole entire house. Now, this experience and training would be needed for him later to lead all of Egypt. Remembering that Egyptian life is completely different. It's centered on the Nile, completely different from what he grew up in Canaan. So now he's in a worse position. He still remains a slave, but now instead of being in a home, in a position of authority, he's in the bottom in an incredibly dingy, dark, horrific prison, one of the strongest prisons in the country. So this is a low point in his life. He's in a prison in a foreign place. He has no friends, no prospects of being released. Where's God? It brings us to our final section, the rise of Joseph again, in 21 and through 23. The text says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. And the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper." Again, we see the Lord was with Joseph, the same phrase that was used earlier. So it shows us that although outside circumstances had changed, in this case for the worse, God was still with him, still causing Joseph to work with integrity and honor, and also that his work would prosper. It was noticeably more productive. And notice it says that the Lord extended kindness to him. Literally stretched out the word there is hesed. It's the covenant faithfulness of God. It shows that Joseph was saved. And that when Joseph's hardships were new and grew larger, God's faithfulness also stretched out and met those hardships. And God granted him favor in the sight of the jailer. So just as God had granted favor in Potiphar's eyes, so too in the chief jailer's eyes. And so that whatever was done there, which would be manual labor, food, clothing, whatever else needed cleaning, that was now put in Joseph's charge. So again, we must see that Joseph didn't just stroll in here and given a position of authority, but he was in prison and he had to work. He had to prove, and that took time. It didn't happen immediately. And in fact, we read in Psalm 105:17 that he sent a man, God sent Joseph before them, who was Joseph, who was sold as a slave, and they afflicted his feet with fetters, and he himself was laid in irons, until the time that his word came to pass, and the word of the Lord tested him. And then the next part talks about him going before Pharaoh. It communicates that he was afflicted in his feet in chains, in prison, and that he himself lay in irons. That phrase, some scholars think that means his neck was also bound, and that he was there until the time that his word, which was communicated to Joseph through the dream, came to pass. So we see that Joseph's time in prison wasn't all that great. He definitely suffered. And he definitely had instances where he could question, well, where's God in this? I'm supposed to be the child of promise, that people will be bowing to me. How is this? I'm being faithful to God, and this is my reward. So to be put in a position of authority in a prison as a prisoner, that took time and was still not a great position. But the text emphasizes again that the Lord was with him. Yahweh was still in control of the circumstances. And we see, again, a third time that Joseph is now being raised up in a house and given a place of authority. So we see this pattern of Joseph being faithful and God blessing. And if we compare the text here, there's 5 points of comparison where we see the same thing that happened in Potiphar's house happen again in the jail. So we see Joseph's character and his faith in God continue in spite of his rising and falling in circumstances. So although this chapter leaves us with Joseph in prison in Egypt, far from having authority over his own family, there is a positive note of God's grace, and we expect good things yet to come. So let's move on to applications. Number 1, Joseph is an example of one who is faithful to God regardless of his circumstances. He experienced great blessings as well as great lows and injustice. Number 2, our God is in control of our circumstances, working things towards his perfect end. Through it all, he demonstrates his covenant love and extends his grace to us. And as with Joseph, when our hardship grows, God's faithfulness extends out to meet our needs in those hardships. Number 3, both in Joseph's brothers and in Potiphar's wife, we see the harm of a lying tongue. It is characteristic of Satan's kingdom, which is the unnamed force of evil in our narrative that is trying to stop the purposes of God and his people. Deceitful lips have no place among God's people. And then number 4, disobedience to God's moral law carries multifaceted consequences. It damages one's reputation, it hurts relationships, and it is a sin and offense against God and his ruler. We must take sin seriously, despise it, and flee from it, even when that means that we're going to experience loss. That is the story of the life of Joseph in these two houses.